What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Alan Wall's Photography. I am Alan, and if you own a DSLR and have ever found yourself wondering, is it supposed to do that? You've come to the right place. Stick around. So credit for this video goes to Stephen in the UK. It was Stephen's question that got this whole ball rolling. He had got in touch with me to ask about a camera that he had just bought, his first full-frame Nikon camera, which was a D750, a really fine camera, a real workhorse. And his question was, is the viewfinder supposed to be dark on the D750? He had read some articles, and I have now read some articles where people have complained about this in the past. But my personal experience with the camera, and with every other full-frame Nikon camera that I have used, there should be no darkening of the viewfinder whatsoever. I have always found the D750 second only to the D850 in the clarity and brightness, edge to edge, of the viewfinder. So his question was, he's only got a few days before he can return this camera. Is this something that sounds like a problem with the camera? And I have to say it probably does. And let me explain why. First of all, he just had the one lens that he was using with the camera. It was a good lens, a Sigma 105mm f2.8 macro lens. And it's worth mentioning that he's had this lens for a good long time, and he's used it on a number of other cameras, and he's never had any issues whatsoever with it. So the likelihood that the darkening of his viewfinder was related to a problem with the lens seemed unlikely. Unfortunately, he didn't have a second lens to try on the camera. That would have been helpful information to know if the problem persisted with, say, a short prime wide open at 1.4 or 1.8. Then it would give us more ammunition, but it's probably not the lens. So if it's not the lens, why would the viewfinder on a DSLR be dark or darker than it's supposed to be? To understand that, you have to understand the mechanism of a single lens reflex camera and what the viewfinder is actually doing. When you're taking pictures in viewfinder mode, as in not using live view, the camera has a mirror that lies in the path of the light that would normally be impinging on the sensor or on the shutter in front of the sensor on a mirrorless camera. And you can see the mirror if you take the body cap off whatever DSLR you have. The first thing you see is that shiny surface. That's a mirror. And it's positioned at 45 degrees. And the reason for that is it is directing the light straight up into this lump at the top of your camera, wherein lie two very important components of the camera. The first is a focusing surface. It's usually a Fresnel lens or a piece of frosted glass, depending on the camera that you have. Nikon uses some proprietary material, but it does the same thing. It gives a focusing plane that the image can be formed on. Now, directly above that is a complex system of mirrors that in cheaper cameras is known as a Penta Mirror, and in the more expensive cameras and all of Nikon's full-frame cameras is known as a Penta Prism. They both do the same thing, and truth be told, the Penta Mirror cameras tend to have darker viewfinders. That's for a number of reasons that we may get into in a minute. But the purpose of the Penta Mirror or Penta Prism is to correct the light beam that's coming into the camera through the lens. Obviously, or maybe not obviously, but when light enters the camera after going through the lens, the image is upside down and it is side to side inverted. That's the way the camera sees it. Interestingly, that's also the way your eye sees it, but our brain corrects it. The camera doesn't actually have a brain to correct it, so it uses the pentaprism. So what happens is, as the light comes in, it hits the mirror and it gets thrown up onto this focusing screen. And then as the light enters the pentaprism, it is bounced around off the 5 walls of the prism, or the 5 mirrored surfaces of a Penta mirror. And then the image is directed back to the small glass optical window at the back of the camera where your eye's positioned, so that you're seeing it precisely what you would see in the photograph. So in Stephen's case, we think it's probably not the lens because of what I mentioned earlier, his good experience with it with other cameras. And I don't think it has anything to do with the actual primary optical chain that leads to the sensor, because his photographs are fine. There's no vignetting in the photographs. The edges are fine. There's no darkening. The images are exactly what you would expect from a high-end full-frame camera, which means the problem has to be somewhere in the viewfinder optical chain. So what could it be? It could be the mirror. It could be the focusing surface underneath the pentaprism, or it could be the pentaprism. I suppose it could also be gunk on the inside of the viewing window at the back. But that is what I told Stephen, that there are a number of ways that could happen. If dirt or grime or oil or lubricant from the lens was somehow to get onto the mirror, and we didn't think it was the mirror because you can inspect the mirror pretty easily just by looking in the camera, and there was no gunk on the mirror. But it's a little harder to see the focusing screen, and in fact, that could have a deposit of oil or grime on it that could very significantly decrease the light in the viewfinder. Similarly, if the mirroring surfaces, the pentaprism has several of its 5 faces, polished and coated to a mirror finish to bounce the light around. And there could be a problem with that. There could be a problem with the glass itself in the pentaprism. If the glass has become internally damaged somehow and has become cloudy, that could darken the viewfinder as well. And lastly, like I say, something building up on the window at the back could also give that impression. And that is very much what it looked like to me. He sent me some photographs taken with an iPhone through the viewfinder, and there was a very odd top-heavy vignetting in the viewfinder that was not replicated in the photographs. So what he did was exactly what I would recommend. The first thing you do is you ask other people who are familiar with the camera, have one or have had one in the past, and ask them, did they see this abnormality or hear this abnormality, as we're going to be talking about in a minute. Another place you can go are some of the online forums. Nikon has multiple forums, Nikonians being a really, really good one. But you can also go to sites like Ugly Hedgehog, which have some very active forums, and ask a large number of people. And you're going to get helpful answers by doing that. But at the end of the day, this is a real investment. This is $1,000 minimum that you're going to spend on a used D750 with a low shutter count. And if it's not exactly what you're expecting or what your friends tell you to be expecting from that camera, the most prudent thing to do is send the thing back while you still can. Worst case scenario, you waste some time and you end up with another camera with exactly the same issue, and you could discover that that's normal. But usually, if you've done your due diligence, that won't be the case. So the bottom line for this first question of should I see darkening in the viewfinder of my D750, the answer is no. And the recommendation is send it back while you still can. Get another copy. So the second question concerned recording video on a DSLR where the audio of the camera picks up a grinding machine-like noise when recording video. Now, it turns out in this case that it was only with a couple of lenses that the camera would make this noise, but the noise was very obvious on the recording. And it turns out that the only lenses that were causing this were lenses that had Nikon's version of image stabilization, which is called vibration reduction. And a lot of Nikon's lenses have that built in. If you're shooting video with the onboard audio of your DSLR and you're using a lens that has VR, vibration reduction, and the vibration reduction is turned on or engaged, you are going to hear the motors that are stabilizing the image in that lens. That's where that comes from. It is normal. It also ruins your video if you're using the camera's audio. So the solution is, number one, to turn off the VR. The VR should always be off whenever the lens is in on a camera, on a tripod anyway. But even handheld, turn that off. That'll get rid of that sound. If you can't turn it off because you have tremors of some kind and you really need the VR on, then the next solution is to move your audio out of the camera. Now, you don't actually have to remove it from the camera. You can use the camera's built-in audio, but you shouldn't use the camera's built-in microphone. Add a second microphone on a shock mount. One of the small Rode microphones would be just fine. Simply separating it by that amount of distance from the onboard microphone will get rid of that grinding noise you hear from the VR. So handheld video with a VR lens, the grinding noise is normal. You don't have to send anything back. You just have to turn it off. The third question that I got asked this week was also about a noise coming from a DSLR, and this is a clicking noise that comes from the camera when shooting in live view, whether you're using manual or autofocus. Have you ever experienced that, to have the camera in live view and while you're composing the shot or focusing the shot, you hear this unending clicking coming from the camera? This is also normal, and what you're hearing is actually kind of coming from the camera, but also coming from the lens. What you're hearing is the aperture being adjusted continuously. The way this works, and the reason it's different from viewfinder photography, where you don't hear the clicking, is in viewfinder photography, while you're composing your shot and doing your focusing, your aperture is wide open. It's automatically going to open to the largest extent that it can for the lens. So an f2.8 lens is going to be on f2.8 while you compose the shot. When you press the shutter button, however, the aperture will snap to the setting that you had, say f11, while the shot is taken, then immediately spring back to 2.8 again so that you can compose your next shot. In live view, that is not the case. In live view, the camera adjusts the lens aperture to give you the exposure that you've dialed into your settings, which means as you move your camera or change your focus or change your subject, every time you do that, the camera is recalculating what the aperture needs to be in order to give you the exposure that you've told the camera to give you. So the aperture is constantly changing, making small adjustments to ensure that the live view picture is exposed properly, and when you release the electronic shutter with the by touching the screen or using the shutter release button, you are already seeing on the screen what you're going to get in the photograph. So the noise that you hear, the clicking noise you hear when composing a shot in live view is normal. It's not just the shutter. There's also some micro adjustment of the autofocus, which adds to the noise. It's pretty noisy doing that, but if you're new to DSLRs and it's driving you crazy that the thing clicks in live view, forget about it. It's completely normal. If you have a DSLR and you're brand new to using DSLRs and you're composing a scene with your camera and your finger happens to press the button on the right side of the lens, in some cameras it's not marked, it's just a small black button. It's the depth of preview button. And the question I was asked is, when I press that button, my viewfinder goes dark. I can't see anything. Is this normal? Yes, that's normal. That's what it's supposed to do. The depth of field preview allows you to see the image that you're going to get when you press the shutter. Remember, I told you that when you're composing photographs in viewfinder mode, the aperture is wide open. Well, when you press the depth of field preview button, it shuts the aperture down to what you have set on the camera. So if you're shooting at f11, when you press the depth of field preview, the camera will close the lens's aperture down to f11. The purpose being so that you can look at the depth of field and see, is this enough? Is this what I want for this photograph? Am I going to get everything that I want in sharp focus? But in doing that, it's also showing you how much light is going to get through the aperture, and it's considerably less than a wide open lens. So that's why it darkens when you hit the depth of field preview. It's completely normal. It tells you that it's doing what it's supposed to do and working. So don't send your camera back for that. The last one is not really is the camera supposed to do that? It's a clarification of something that I said in a previous video, the one on indoor macro lighting options. And I think I confused some people because a Mr. Bumble got in touch with me with a question that prompted me to go back and listen to it. And I didn't explain one thing clearly enough. So Mr. Bumble is new to photography, and like so many of us, he is hopelessly hooked on macro photography. And after watching my video, he was confused, and rightly so. So his question was this: when I'm shooting using a flash and I have a maximum sync speed of 1/200th of a second, how can I possibly freeze any action? And it's a really good question, and I understand his confusion, because I really didn't go into this in quite enough detail. When you're shooting outdoors in continuous light, true, your action is going to be frozen by the shutter speed. The faster the shutter speed, the more effectively you're going to be able to freeze the action. But when you're shooting with flash, it's different. The maximum shutter speed for use with flash exists for a different reason. Let me explain how a shutter works. A shutter actually consists in modern cameras of a mechanism whereby two leaflets of the shutter pass in front of the sensor and expose the sensor to the light coming through the lens into the camera for a very short period of time. The way the shutter works is when you press the shutter button, the first of two leaflets falls across the sensor, exposing it to the light. And then very soon thereafter, the second leaflet of the shutter drops down and covers the sensor again. So that's what the shutter speed is. Now, up to about 1/200th of a second on Nikon DSLRs anyway, 1/200th is the safest, the fastest speed that you can safely use without the capture of one of the shutters in front of the sensor, which leaves a black bar across the picture. For example, if you were using a shutter speed of 1/800th of a second, at that kind of shutter speed, the bottom, or it's called the front curtain, is the one that goes first. The front curtain isn't completely across the sensor before the second curtain starts to drop behind it. So basically you just have a strip of the sensor being exposed to the light. And if that happens with a flash, then when the flash goes off and one of the leaflets of the shutter is still in front of the sensor, that's what you're going to see in your photograph, is a blacked out sensor where the shutter was. So what's different about using flash is the shutter speed is not what is controlling the effective period of time that the sensor is exposed to light. What I mean by that is at 1/200th of a second, the leaflets are not going to be obscuring any part of the sensor, but that is not the same as saying that the sensor is exposed to the light during that period of time. The light that is put off by your typical speed light is of very short duration, and at the lowest power on this Godox, 1/128th power, the duration of the flash is somewhere between 1/20,000th and 1/30,000th of a second, which is 2 orders of magnitude faster than the sync speed of the camera. So what in essence is happening, though you have set it to sync speed, meaning that your sensor is going to be exposed for 1/200th of a second, it's only going to be exposed to light for 1/20,000th of a second. So the fact that the shutter is open that period of time is not the same as getting light for that period of time. So when you're using a flash, your effective shutter speed is actually the flash duration. And as I mentioned earlier, the lower the power, the faster the flash duration and the more action you'll be able to freeze, even though your shutter speed isn't going to be above the sync speed of 1/200th of a second. Mr. Bumble has either got it now or he has quit photography forever. I know that is confusing, but it's worth getting that in your head. It comes in useful a lot in photography. All right, before I go, I've got one bonus pro tip. If you're lucky enough to be the recipient of a plastic Nikon 2470 f2.8 coffee mug from the recent holidays, when you finish drinking your coffee, immediately and go and rinse this and put it back in your cupboard. Do not just toss this in the sink to wash later, because I guarantee you'll come back into the kitchen in an hour and see your Nikon 2470 in the sink and you'll have a heart attack, like I have done 3 times since Christmas. All right, that's it. Short and sweet. I hope this was helpful. I hope you heard something that is going to improve your photography. And if you didn't and you still have questions, please leave them for me and I will get them answered. I'll be back in a few days with something else scintillating. If this was helpful, please give me a like. If it was super helpful, please subscribe to the channel so you can get more such stuff. I'll see you in a few days. Until then, farewell and good night.